And 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 11 says, "Now all these things happened unto them for ensamples, and they are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come." Right? So these things are written as examples for us. That's what ensamples mean. They're examples. Right? Now, the Bible is an interesting book where it doesn't give us only the good or only the bad. It gives us everything. Right? This is David's life. This is what David did. This is the consequences of what David did. This is what David did. This is the rewards of what David did. Right? It gives us both the good and the bad. Right? Much like how our lives go. When we make good decisions, there's a benefit to them. When we make bad decisions, it has ramifications on our lives. Same thing happens here. These things are written for who? For us. That's all of us. Right? It goes from Mark in the back there to whoever wants to claim to be the oldest one in here, right? So there's a whole range that it's designed for. We can all take something from it, all right? So that's kind of our filtering where we're going. These are examples for us. What can we learn from them? So then, as we flip back to 2 Samuel, we talked about 2 Samuel chapter 11. That's the story or the account of David's adultery with Bathsheba and the start of the ramifications of those things. Chapter 12 was about Nathan, and Nathan being the prophet that God sent to David and said, no, what you did was wrong, pal. You don't think I know, but I know. Right? So what does that tell us? Did Nathan know what David had done? Probably not, right? So when God comes to Nathan and says, I need you to go to David and tell him such and such things, right? What's going through Nathan's mind if you're Nathan? Okay, what'd he do? What else? He has to go accuse the king. Right. How in the world is this going to go? Is my friendship with David enough? Am I going to end up dead? Because if you remember, there's another example of a prophet going to a king and not giving him good news, and he gets thrown in prison. Right? Ahab and Micaiah. Right? Prophet's just living his life. God comes to him and says, I need you to go to Ahab, or the messengers come. And God gives him a message to give to Ahab. Says, the king has a question for you, and this is what God tells him to answer. And then he gets put into prison until the king comes again in peace. But the prophet had prophesied, you're not coming back. Right? So you wake up one morning just living your life happy as can be, and the next thing you know, your circumstances had dramatically changed. Right? That's one example. Okay? As we move on, 2 Samuel chapter 13. This is kind of where we're picking up. Now, most of 2 Samuel, 11, 12, 14, 15, and on, has to do with David and Bathsheba, Nathan, and then Absalom. But we have this story here in the middle with Amnon and Tamar, Absalom's sister. Okay? So we start off in chapter 13, verses 1 and 2. And it came to pass after this, that Absalom the son of David had a fair sister, whose name was Tamar. And Amnon the son of David loved her. And Amnon was so vexed that he fell sick for his sister Tamar, for she was a virgin. And Amnon thought it hard for him to do anything to her. But Amnon had a friend whose name was Jonadab, the son of Shimeah, David's brother, and Jonadab was a very subtle man. Okay, and then the story goes on from there. But what do we learn from verses 1 through 3? What do we know? Nobody knows anything. It's early on a Sunday. Sure, Absalom had a sister. Okay, what else? Good. Okay, Amnon had some wrong desires there, didn't he? Okay, that he did not properly take care of, right? Okay, so how does that serve as an example for us? Right, otherwise what happens? What happens if we let them fester? Well, eventually we'll act on them. And then how does that go for us? Right, that's sin. When lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin. And sin bringeth forth death, right? Okay, what else do we learn? Yeah, right? Verse 3. What's the first word in verse 3? But. What does that tell you? Trouble, right? So Amnon's trying to deal with stuff on his own, but he had a friend, right? Right? He had a friend. Darlene said, friends will do it every time, right? What kind of friend was this? He was subtle. What does that mean? Sneaky, right? He's got a sneaky friend. Okay? So, parents in here, what does that tell you? Right? Watch out for those sneaky friends. Right? Because how is that going to end? How is that going to influence? Isn't it interesting how bad always influences good? Why doesn't it go the other way? Right? There's so many ways, right? Because we all have our own lusts. We are all, English. We all have our own lusts. We all have our own desires. But when somebody validates that idea, when somebody validates that desire, they're like, oh, okay, it's not just me. Because see, at first, he thought it was hard. Where'd it go? End of verse 2. And Amnon thought it was hard for him to do anything to her. Right? So he knows something's not right with that. He knows that the desire is not right and hasn't acted on it yet. But Amnon had a friend. And what does his friend say? Why art thou being the king's son? Lean from day to day. Wilt thou not tell me? And Amnon said, I love Tamar, my brother's sister. And Jonadab said unto him, and here's our master plan. Right? Okay. So what happened there? The friend validated his inappropriate desires. And now this plan is hatched. Okay? And now this plan is hatched. So we have, as parents, who are our children's friends? Now, those of you who have been parents for any length of time know that you can't fully control who your kids' friends are. Right? I mean, for example, your kids and my kids are in a Sunday school class together. They influence each other. We don't have a ton of control over that. Right? Okay? So, but what influence do we have on our children? We should have a great influence, right? The question is then, do we? Right? As David and his son, did David have as great an influence on his son as he hoped he would have had? No. Right? Now, granted, his son is older. He's making his own decisions. He's got his own house. He's got his own servants. Right? So he's not a little kid anymore. And he's responsible for his own decisions. Okay? So we have influence. We have influence on our kids. We pray for our kids. But yet ultimately, as they get older, that transition of control changes, doesn't it? And then who is responsible? Right? Each child has to, at some point, decide, am I serving God? Or is that my parents' God? Right? And those decisions have to be made. And sometimes it hurts. Peter, go ahead. Sure.
For that affliction to come on his son.
Right. Well, you're right. It does open up a door because as we progress through this story, right, in verse 14, this whole plan was basically laid out for Amnon to rape his sister, right? And that's what happens in verse 4. Howbeit, he would not hearken unto her voice, but being stronger than she, forced her and lay with her, right? And then ends up kicking her out. But in verse 21, we see when King David heard of all these things, what was his reaction? He was very wroth. Right? And then what happens in the next verse? And Absalom spake unto his brother Amnon, neither good nor bad, and Absalom hated Amnon, because he had forced his sister Tamar. So what do we know about David's reaction? It was emotional, right? He was very upset. He was very wroth, it says. But there's no action. Okay, so there's no action behind it. David didn't punish Amnon in any way for his sin, despite his obvious anger. Why not? Wife. Okay, so because David, you're just coming off of chapters 11 and 12 there, right, with Bathsheba. Okay, what does that tell us? Where is David coming from? What is David thinking? Is David mad? Yes, David's mad. Now what? Okay, the prophet did tell him I was going to visit his home. So what? Just let it play out? What? Okay, so David's thinking, okay, wait a minute. How do I deal with this, even though I just did it, but without being called a hypocrite? Right? So, how many of us see the sins we've committed in our children? Right? Because, okay, Satan's not stupid, is he? Right? He knows what you've done. He has the same bag of tricks he's been using for thousands of years. Right? So the same things, the same weaknesses, the same things you have issues with, your kids are probably going to have issues with as well. Right? And this is fresh in David's mind. Okay? So now, how do I appropriately deal with this despite just having done pretty much the same dumb thing?
Nice if he was able to act before his son sinned and say, listen, I did wrong, don't follow what I have done.
Okay, don't follow what I've done. Okay, that's good. And I think David did learn from that because we see that in Solomon. Right? If you look at the early parts in Proverbs, the advice that's given to Solomon about strange women is there. Does he follow it? Right? So there's attempts that are being made there. But then when we're all drawn away of our own lusts, right? Wife, what do you have?
I was wondering if maybe he didn't necessarily come clean with everyone, didn't really make it known what he did to, his whole family, just to people who might have found out. I don't know.
So you don't necessarily think that everybody knew the full situation behind why Bathsheba is now in the house?
Well, to a degree.
To a degree. Well, that could be true.
I mean, especially if Amnon wasn't living at the same place at that time. It could have been rumored, but maybe David didn't actually. The Bible doesn't record that he brought everyone together and said, "This is what I did."
Family meeting, guys.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Dad's sin for a second. Yeah. Right? But what does that do then? What does that cover up do? Nobody wants to admit their sin, especially to other people. It's hard enough we got to do it to God. God already knows, though. People don't know. People judge. What are your kids going to think about you if you drop that bomb on them? Yeah. Pass. And sometimes we do. But then, if these things are written for examples for us, are we not the example for our kids? So, do they not need to see the same things we see in God's Word? Right? Should David have dealt with this? Sure. Right? Is sin sin? Right? So, in being dealt with, if David dealt with Amnon, and Amnon calls him a hypocrite, what does David say? I did the same dumb thing, and guess what? God punished me. Why? Same reason I'm punishing you. It's sin. Sin is sin. Sin has to be dealt with. Right? Even if you committed the same sin, it has to be dealt with. Why? Look what happens. What happens with Amnon and Absalom? 2 years go by. He's just sitting there waiting, festering, right? And right, Amnon's a sitting duck, right? It's like a mob hit, right, from those old mob movies, that I'm sure none of you have watched. Right? And in verses 32 and 33, Absalom kills Amnon. Why? Why did he kill him? His dad didn't do anything about it. Right? His dad didn't do anything about it. I've talked to the kids before, the teens, about, I call it gangland justice. Right? I only had one brother. Right? But even in that relationship, when I don't get away with things he gets away with, right? I know it's wrong. Why don't mom and dad take care of it? Okay, I'll take care of it for them. Right, Ian? Yeah, there you go. Ian knows. You've heard that before. Yep. But what happens then? We have to watch that, don't we? Because what actually builds up? Bitterness. Bitterness towards who? Bitterness towards the person. Why are they special? And against the person who should have taken care of it. Right? Against the parents. Right? Think about this now. What happens? The same situation just happened. Absalom now has bitterness towards Amnon. Lets that fester. Lets that plan. I bet you what's-his-face was involved too. Jonadab was involved in this too. And two years later, he gets killed. But then what else does Absalom do? Remember that it bleeds into the rebellion that Absalom has towards David and drawing men away, right? Why doesn't my dad deputize somebody? Oh, if I were a judge in the land, right, I would take care of your problem because your cause is right. Oh, it's just like me and my brother, right? But on a bigger scale, okay? What happened with David Bathsheba, Absalom, Amnon, and even the rebellion that Absalom has towards David. What's the end result in all those things? What's the end result? Death. Oh, what verse does that bring to mind? The wages of sin is physical sometimes, definitely spiritual, right? All right, very good. So, in verse 34, Absalom ends up killing Amnon 2 years later, and he flees the country, right? He gets out of Dodge. Why does he flee? Why does he stand and not take it and say, well, you didn't do anything about it, so I took care of it? Why does he flee? Because he figures he may be taken out. Why? Amnon was first in line for the throne. What else? What do we think about sin? Okay, that we can run from it. What else? Okay, he knew sin should be punished, so he took care of the problem, but then he realizes, well, now I'm on the end of that. But why? Why did he flee? What do we think about sins in general? Right? So, let me ask you this. Which is worse, adultery or murder? Huh? Both? But what do we... Right, we think murder is worse. We like to put a hierarchy on sin. Well, it's just a lie. Right? It's not like I committed adultery. Oh, I committed adultery. It's not like I killed someone. Right? Right? But what does James 2:10 tell us about breaking the law? Right? You're guilty of all. Because it's a question of, did you break the law? That's it. Right? You have a cup. If you drop it on the ground and it breaks, did you break the cup? Yes. Well, it's not like it's a little break. It only broke in 2 pieces. Right? Okay? The cup is still broken. That's why he probably got out of Dodge, is because he thought, well, okay, this is more serious, right? So if we take a look then, where do we see another example of this bitterness festering resulting in somebody's death? Think of one of the generals of Israel. Joab and Abner, right? Abner killed Joab's brother in battle, right? After he was warned, dude, get away from me. You can go back to Cain and Abel, right? Because this is not the first time we've seen it, right? So what does that tell us? If you go all the way back to, where's Cain and Abel? Genesis. Where are we now? We're in the same situation now. Right? So what does that tell us? Our nature has not changed. You know what else hasn't changed? Our adversary. Our adversary hasn't changed either. He's still using the same tricks. But we don't pay attention to the examples we have and are trying to solve these math problems on our own. Peter. Yeah, they don't go to God, right? Because who gets vengeance? Who gets revenge? Who is that, right? Just leave that to me. How hard, though, is that? when something happens to one of your children and you go, oh, let God take care of him. That's hard. That's hard. What does that take? Lots of grace, lots of faith, right? Wow. Okay. Chuck, you had your hand up?
Thinking or considering sin, we need to nip that in the bud, because otherwise it's going to fester, it's going to grow something, and sin will be birthed.
Mm-hmm.
It's like that. It's not that difficult. It's not. I have to admit, if one of my children was harmed by somebody, that would be extremely difficult.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I would even be able to overcome that, but I knew I would know what's right. I'd have to go to him and ask him to help me not to consider that course of action, consider what my flesh wants.
Sure. The thing is, Amnon knew what was right until his friend, right? Absalom knew what was right. That's why he fled, right? So even though we know what's right, ooh, right? Our heart is deceitfully wicked. Right? We've talked about that before. It'll do whatever it takes in order to sin. Right? It'll take whatever, including lying to you. Right? Or sending a friend. Okay? 2 Samuel 15. Let's move on. This is after Absalom flees. 2 years go by. Actually, 3 years go by, I think. Yes, in chapter 13, verse 38, so Absalom fled and went to Geshur and was there for 3 years. All right, so he's hiding there for 3 years. Later he returns, right? Good old Joab brings him back because Joab realizes David is still pining for his son, right? So he brings him back, okay? But the two never still talk. So that's a whole bizarre thing. But in 2 Samuel chapter 15, verse 10, we start to see Absalom's intentions here. Absalom sent spies throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, as soon as ye hear the sound of the trumpet, then ye shall say, Absalom reigneth in Hebron. Right? So there's a conspiracy, right? A rebellion against his father, David, right? Which then directly ties to what Nathan in chapter 12 said was gonna happen. All right, so now we start to see these direct actual ties and fulfillments happening here, right? In verse 12, jump down to verse 12. And Absalom sent for Ahithophel the Gilonite, David's counselor from his city, even from Gilo, while he offered sacrifices. And the conspiracy was strong, for the people increased continually with Absalom. Okay, so remember, what do we know about Ahithophel? Valerie brought it up last week. Right, he's Bathsheba's grandfather. Okay? Yes. Right. Right, very good. Okay, so if we put all this together, right, Ahithophel being the grandfather, David's counselor, okay, did David know who his counselor was? Yeah. Michelle's the only one who got it. She's like, oh yeah, right, okay. So, does David know who Eliam is? Do you know who Eliam is? Eliam is one of David's mighty men. All right? So think about the ties that are happening here. You have Ahithophel the counselor, ties to David. Okay? Now, we also learned that in 2 Samuel 16, where the counsel of Ahithophel is like asking at the oracles of God, right? So what Ahithophel is saying is true, is righteous, is godly, is coming from God, however you want to phrase it, right? Okay? So shouldn't be questioned, okay? So you got Ahithophel there. Eliam's the father. Eliam is one of David's mighty men. Uriah is also in the army, which is probably where those two connected. And it was like, hey, I got a daughter, or hey, your daughter, she's nice looking, right? And that gets set up. So those two know each other, okay? Both in the army. So when he sends and inquires, hey, who's that? What should David have known? Do you have any idea what you're doing? Right? The ties that are there, the effects that are there. Why is Ahithophel part of this rebellion? He feels betrayed, right? He's David's counselor, right? You feel that your position, your standing should afford you some protection for your family, right? Think about a pastor, right? Leads the church, counsels you of God, right? Has children. How do people look at, think about, act towards a pastor's children? Right? Oftentimes, they're thought of as targets. Right? Oftentimes, they're the ones that are gossiped about. Right? Oftentimes, they're the ones that are preyed upon. Why is that? Think about who our adversary is and what he's trying to do. Okay? Does that sow distrust then between congregation and pastor's family? Sure. Right? Well, what does Satan want? Unity or disunity? Right? So think about what's going on there, okay? So we see the involvement of Ahithophel there. But one of the things that I want to point out, and we know, hopefully most of us are familiar with the story then of Absalom and the counsel that's given and the battle and how Absalom dies and all that, right? But what I want to focus on now is did God abandon David? You go back to chapter 12 and the pronouncement of what God says is going to happen to David and to his house in perpetuity, right? The question is did God abandon David? What do you think, Sandy? Okay. David is a man after God's own heart. What else? God made a covenant with him. Is God going to break that covenant? No. Chuck?
What you're looking at playing out here isn't necessarily an act of God. It's a natural consequence of David's sin. The optics are terrible. It gives Absalom a tremendous opportunity.
Okay.
Because Absalom looks righteous because he killed Amnon and David didn't.
Right.
I mean, the people aren't thinking, well, they shouldn't murder anybody. David should have dealt with it. So I can see how the conspiracy is strong. You know what I mean?
Sure.
So, this is a consequence of David's sin and then not dealing fully with his sin.
So in these consequences, did God abandon David? No. Right? Think about what David prays. What does David pray once he realizes Ahithophel is with Absalom? right? Further down in chapter 15, 31, right? And one told David, saying, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. And David said, O Lord, I pray thee, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness, right? And then the next verse, and it came to pass that when David was come to the top of the mountain where he worshipped God, behold, Hushai the Archite came to meet him with his coat rent and earth upon his head. And we know from the rest of the story how Hushai goes back and is instrumental in defeating the counsel of Absalom. Ahithophel. Yeah, I knew that. Right? But that's what's happening there. So, even in the rough consequences / punishment of sin, are we abandoned? God is still with us. Does that God still answers our prayers, even in the middle of the punishment or the consequences or whatever we're dealing with? Okay? Think about David and how God used David as part of these 2 situations / 3 situations, right? Okay? We all know that, well, we might not all know. Some of us know that the Psalms, when David gets in trouble, he's writing a psalm, right? Okay? Psalm 51, for example. If you turn there, Psalm 51. Psalm 51 is written after Nathan came to him and told him what God had to say about his sin, right? And it starts off, Have mercy upon me, O God, according to thy loving kindness, according unto the multitude of thy tender mercies, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from mine iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I acknowledge my transgression, and my sin is ever before me. Right? Okay, so and it goes on from there. But Psalm 51 is a common one. Do you know that there are more? Right? It's said that there are 22 Psalms written by David due to the sin with Bathsheba and the death of the child and his dealings with the rebellion of Absalom. 22 Psalms. That's a huge chunk. Sandy. Sure. So the question is whether David could have possibly talked to Absalom about his sin and whether he was called a hypocrite or anything at that point. According to what the Bible indicates, it doesn't look like David talked to Absalom at all. After the death of Amnon, dude's gone. He flees. He's gone for 3 years. Did they send a letter? I have no idea. It doesn't seem like it. Just the way you read about Joab's reaction in trying to bring about a reconciliation between the two. So it doesn't seem like it. Even then, after Absalom is brought back into Jerusalem, the two don't talk. Absalom is trying to get a conversation with the king. He's like, why did you even bring me here if I'm not going to be able to see him? Right? And set Joab's field on fire, right, after being ignored for so long. So, I mean, you're looking at a good, easy 3, maybe up to 5 years of, I don't know what's going on, and not talking to each other. The one obviously likes the other one, right? In the battle, when he ends up dying, he's mourning and wailing and, and all that. And Joab goes to him, dude, you're a clown, right? Not those exact words. That's my version, right? But that whole thing is messed up. Go ahead. Right. It doesn't mean, yeah, you're right. In our lives, there's often the attempts at reconciliation, and one side ignores the other one. It doesn't look like an attempt was made by either side. Actually, more so of an attempt on Absalom's side towards David in his conversations with Joab. Hey, bring me before the king. Why did you bring me here? Why am I here? Those kinds of conversations. And he gets so frustrated at it that Joab starts to ignore him that he sets his field on fire. It's like, what do I got to do to get your attention? And then after that is when you start seeing, Absalom sitting in the gate and, oh, that I were deputy of the king, right? And that bitterness starts to come out then. And how you see him then from that point start to draw men away. Right? Yep, yeah, no problem. So yeah, very good. There are 22 Psalms that are written about just this situation. Some more obvious than others, right? But what's the point? Why? Why? Why so many Psalms? It was ever before him, right? Okay. What else? Well, let me ask you this. When you go through a hard time, when you're down in the dumps, when you can't figure out what to read, where do you go? Psalms. Right? And what does that do for you? Right? Okay, because, all right, when we compare ourselves to David, okay, not too bad. I screwed up, David screwed up. Let's see, God loved David, God loves me, right? God forgave David, God will forgive me, right? God restored David, God will restore me. God watched over and protected David, God will watch over and protect me. Right? Why are these things written? Right? Very good. For an example unto us. Right? Because what does God know? You're no different than David. Right? We're no different than David. Our adversary is still the same, and our God is still the same. And with that, we'll conclude our epic adventure through God's Word today, and y'all are dismissed.